Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you all here at Garden City Church of Christ this morning. It's wonderful to have you all out. I do see some new faces, so I'm glad that you have come to join us again this week as we're slowly, everybody getting back into the swing of back into church, and that's what we want to see this morning. Once again, I want to welcome you. I hope you will take time. We know we don't have any bulletins. There's no yellow cards to turn in. And offering containers are in the back in the foyer to turn in your offering for the week, so we don't pass that around. For those of you that have been here, so we're not passing the plates. So we're not doing that. And hopefully you've also picked up your communion cup on the way in. If you did not, they are also in the foyer, so you can still take part in communion later on this service. All right? Go ahead and turn around to each other. Just keep it right away. Hi, good morning. Say good morning to everyone. So you can't quite shake hands today. All right, we're going to sing some more songs and continue to praise the Lord today, so please sing with us. As we lead into our time of communion here, we're as a band, introduce new songs. You're welcome to sing along with us. We hope you do. Catherine's going to lead this one for us. It's called The Power of the Cross. And just the words alone you see on the screen. The power of the cross is what brings us here. It's from that cross that saved us. That's what gives us our saving grace in Christ, is that He gave Himself on that cross. So play it, I hope you sing with us.
To see the dawn of the darkness fade, Christ on the road to Calvary, tried by sinful men, torn and beat and bled, nailed to a cross.
Good morning. Morning. Good to see more faces here this morning. And as we've been going through a lot of changes here at church, we do want you to know that we appreciate you being here and the support that the leadership has received. We also want you to know that we will have more communications about Brian Graves and his family leaving in the coming days. And so if you'll bear with us, and as a leadership, we would greatly appreciate that, and look forward to speaking with you and learning from you guys on how we can continue to go forward with our congregation here as part of the greater church of Jesus Christ. Before we pray for the communion, I would ask that you guys go ahead and grab your cups, and if you would go ahead and peel the top off and grab the wafer. We will pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for the many, many blessings that we're able to experience in being a part of your church. We thank you for guiding and directing us. We ask, Lord, that you would continue to extend that grace and mercy that you had in your plans from the beginning of this time on earth. We thank you, Lord, for the blessing of fellowship. We thank you for the blessing of this time that we're able to set aside and worship and remember who you are and your great love for each one of us. Lord, as we consider the loaf in front of us, help us to be reminded of your great plan to reconcile us for the sin that we've committed against you. And the fact that you were willing to pay the ultimate price and offer up the ultimate sacrifice in your Son, Jesus. And so as we do take of this loaf, Lord, we think of his broken body, both physically and spiritually, paying the price for the sin that we committed. And Lord, as we drink of the cup, we consider the blood that was spilled by the perfect Jesus Christ. Lord, help us to understand your will and your great love in this sacrifice. Help us to then leave these doors and offer that grace and love to those who we come in as we go. You are an awesome God, Lord, and we just praise you for this time. It is in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. Go ahead and take the cup.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
It is good to see you all. These be Andy's.
Okay.
Do you need these? I will when I play.
Okay.
But you can. Okay. Thank you.
Just like at home.
Yeah, just like that. Usually we find them on top of our head, right? I would like to say thank you for all that have, again, as Andy has said, kind of helped us get through some of the transitions, not the least being COVID, and trying to help us do that well, and appreciate all of your efforts. And at this time, what we would like to offer is the opportunity for parents that would like their children go with Becky and Claire. They are going to take them and have some children's time with them So if you would like to go, just follow Becky and Claire out, and they'll help take care of it. I think Becky's been in contact with families as much as possible there. And while they are leaving, I want to let you know that we have some prayer things going on. I don't want to mention names, but we have two folks in our congregation that this month are going to be going in for gallbladder surgery to remove their gallbladder. So I want to keep them in your prayers. And then we also have a couple in our church that are having some heart conditions that we want to keep them in prayer. One that's being tested and finding out what's going to happen there. And then another one that is having a surgery tomorrow for a valve replacement up at IU Methodist. So as we know of things, I know it's a little bit harder. We can't share as many of our prayer requests because we don't have our yellow cards, but I want to remind you that you're welcome to email those to us and let us know as a staff, and we'll try to get those communicated as quickly as we possibly can. If you have your Bibles with you this morning, I do hope that you do, either by phone or through the written word here on the book. I encourage you to open it to 2 Corinthians in the New Testament, 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, as we're going to be looking this morning at our series that we're continuing on Grace is Greater, with the message, Grace is greater than our weakness. Grace is greater than our weakness. And we're going to be in 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter. What we're going to see through Paul addressing the church at Corinth is this, is while they were very much wanting to celebrate in their strengths and accomplishments, Paul's going to turn it around and say, rather it is better for you to glorify in your weaknesses. And why would he say that? It's because of this. And so I'm just going to give you the point here at the beginning, and that is that our weaknesses give space for God to show up. Our weaknesses give space for God to show up, for God to powerfully and visibly demonstrate His presence in our life. But I can already tell you that that's not a very comfortable thing to do, and Paul, as he's writing to this early church at Corinth, has got a heavy task in front of him, because much like a city of today, when you think of Chicago or Los Angeles or New York City, these are places in our own country, even today, that place a lot of value on things like strength, education, and accomplishments. What we have here in 2 Corinthians is Paul's letter that was second written that we know of, but there could have been a few others, but we at least know he wrote two. That's why we have them 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And somewhere between the first letter that Paul wrote to this newer church that he helped to establish, and between this second letter, Paul's having to address a concern at this church where the people had started coming into the church, had filtered into the church, and they were false teachers. And they had arrived and they were winning people over with their message that wasn't the message of the gospel, but they were really winning people over about talking about their experiences, about their strengths. They really honed in on the religious experience, and they were telling the people at Corinth that their real faith that they were placing wasn't just enough. It was needed, that they needed to have this religious experience. I got to be honest with you, we need to be careful, oh so careful, when we start thinking that religious experiences take over our true and solid faith that we have in Christ. Too many people today are looking for the experience and the feeling without being won over by Christ and sold out for Him. And so here in this letter, Paul has to address this. He doesn't want the church at Corinth, those Christians, to be won over by human strength or wisdom or accomplishments. Rather, he wants them to delight in their weakness so that they can truly experience God's power. And so, celebrating their weaknesses, by doing that, they can experience God's grace more fully. Now, that's a tall order that Paul has in front of him, even for today. For like Corinth, we very much live in culture that is putting a ton of emphasis rather on our strength and our abilities and our accomplishments and our self-reliance. All you have to do is look at what we glorify the most, although that's been taken away a little bit, hasn't it, from our COVID-19. I still wonder if maybe this experience that we're going through now, while I don't believe God brought it to us, I do think God's going to use it. But I don't know that he's using it for unbelievers. I think he's using it more for believers. To really ask ourselves, what have we put our faith and our trust in? So how's Paul going to do that? Well, he's going to start by doing something that they value. And he's going to feel very awkward in doing so. He's going to talk about his strengths. He's going to make a list of accomplishments. And he basically at some point calls these other people, well, they are super apostles, where I'm just a regular apostle. And he's going to talk about sounding like a madman because he talks so truthfully about his experiences, his religious experience. So he's going to start by sharing his strengths and his accomplishments, but then he's going to turn the tale over and he's going to show them that it's really useless to try to rely on those things in your Christian walk. So with me in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, let's start in verse 21, where Paul talks to these believers near the end of this letter. In verse 21, Paul says this, I say this to our shame. We have been too weak for all of this conversation. But in whatever anyone dares to boast, and you see these little parentheses, I'm talking foolishly here, I also dare. What you have to understand is Paul doesn't want to do this. Paul doesn't want to toot his own horn. He doesn't want to boast about what experiences he's had in his walk with Christ. But he's going to do a little bit of it right here. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? Well, so am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? You can probably guess where some of his conflicts were coming from Jewish, what they call Judaizers. So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm talking like a madman. I'm a better one, with far more labors, many more imprisonments, far worse beatings, and many times near death. Now, I think we should understand when Paul's writing here, he's going to go on through the rest of those verses, and you can read them on your own, of all the trials and the persecutions. But here's the truth of what Paul's addressing here, is that his approach to ministry, his approach to sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ, is not to make a big deal of himself. He'd rather make a big deal about Christ, his Savior. I think that gives us a good lesson in what we're doing in our culture today. We don't need to boast about the experiences that we have or all that the Lord has brought about in our life. Rather, we need to boast about what weaknesses we have and what Jesus has done in our life because of that. We need better to elevate Christ than we need to elevate ourselves. But he's making his case by using their own value system with them. And so he goes on, and I'm not going to read all of those, but I want to pick up in chapter 12 where he continues a little bit of his boasting. Of the unique incident that happened that he really doesn't want to share, but he's going to. Boasting is necessary, he says in chapter 12, verse 1. It is not profitable, but I will move on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether he was in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. I know that this man, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words which a human being is not allowed to speak. What Paul's saying is, it's because he doesn't want to boast too much, he's saying, I'm that man. 14 years ago, I had this experience, and I went up into heaven. Not just the first heaven, where you all can see when you look up in the sky. Not the second heavens, where you can see the galaxies and the stars and all that. I was up into the third heaven. And I witnessed things that were so amazing, so beautiful, I can't even begin to express them with mere human words. He says in verse 5, I will boast about this person, but not about myself, except of my weaknesses. So Paul's trying his very best to bring about an understanding to these people. This event of going to heaven happened some 14 years ago when Paul's writing this, but yet now he wants to talk about it, and now only in passing he's going to share it with these super apostles that want to talk about their religious experiences. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd like to ask you, what would you do if you had gone to the heaven? Wouldn't you think you might want to talk about it just a little bit? I know that most of us would, because I've seen books out there about it. You know, my 20 minutes in heaven and how I came back. I would tell you that it would be very hard for me not to want to boast just a tad bit if I got the honor of being able to go up into the third heaven and see what was going on there. My next sermon after that experience would be how I was caught up into the third heaven. And I would talk about it. President Trump would have nothing on me when it came to my tweeting of everything that I experienced. Hashtag no filter. I'd make a really big deal out of what I experienced. My book that I'm sure I would write would be called The Third Heaven, Thoughts on Why God Only Chose Me and Not You. You get the point, right? I would work it into every conversation that I had. I don't care what we were talking about. Have you heard about COVID-19? Yes, it's really bad, but have you remembered when I was caught up into the third heaven and all the experiences that I had? What's the weather like? The third heaven was so much nicer. How about those Cubs that aren't going to play at all this year? It doesn't matter. I was in the third heaven with Jesus. That's how I would handle it. You don't have to raise your hand because I'm not going to ask for testimony right now. But I would bet that many of you would have some of the same experiences. Not Paul. I'd make a big deal out of it. Paul would not even mention it. But he is only trying to prove a point. You know what's interesting? Paul doesn't say ever in any of his letters, Paul, the one who was caught up into the third heaven, who had a very unique experience with Jesus Christ. You know how he almost always introduces himself? As Paul, a slave of Christ. That is a theology that we don't talk about very much, is it? Paul, and especially in our politically correct world today, can you imagine going around telling people that you are a slave and you're a slave to the one master, Jesus Christ? That's what Paul says. He says, I'm but just a slave. I'm a slave to Christ. You can see it in his letters that he writes to Rome. In his letter he writes to Philemon and to the church at Philippi and to Titus. He mentions it as that's the very first reference about who he is. You know what it is about a slave? A slave has no resume. A slave really has no heritage and no lineage of which they can write about. They only know one thing, and that is the master that they serve. Paul is saying to us as Christians, all you need to know about me is that I'm a slave of Christ, and that's all that matters. Paul has a very impressive resume. There is not very many people that bat in the same league with a Paul. He had all the right credentials. He was a very bright man. He studied under the greatest teacher that was in that day, Gamaliel, that you actually reference and see in the book of Acts. He had easy things to put his pride in who he was. He could have put a lot of confidence in his strengths, but rather Paul would turn the coin over and say, I'd rather talk about my weaknesses. And then he's going to go on and share, after he does all this boasting, he's going to share how God taught him about how great his weaknesses were, because it was going to teach Paul total dependence on Jesus Christ. Look with me in chapter 12, beginning in verse 7. And right in the middle of that verse, here's what he says. so that I would not exalt myself. Excuse me. A thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to torment me, so that I would not exalt myself. He says that twice. Concerning this, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it would leave me, this thorn in his flesh. Paul begs 3 times for God to take away this thorn. Wouldn't you love to know what that thorn was in Paul's life? We don't really have to know what it was in order to relate and understand Paul. How many of you sitting here today have something that you have asked God to remove from your life? Or have you pleaded with the Lord, please change this about me? Please heal this part of me. Please take it away, Lord. I don't want to deal with this anymore. Paul says that while it was a messenger of Satan, God used that thorn, and he refused to take it away from Paul. God didn't bring the thorn, but he certainly allows Satan to use that thorn. I think when I'm going through this with Paul, I'm reading right now in my own personal time in the Bible about Job again. Job, who suffered so much, who understood that it was allowed by God, even though he couldn't see the whole picture. I think it's helpful to us with whatever thorn might be in your life. You know what that is, that you understand that maybe Satan sent it, and maybe he did it to really irritate you. But God, even though he could remove it, chooses not to remove it. Why doesn't he? Why doesn't God, who has all ability and strength and power, could remove this from Paul's life? Well, Paul gives the answer. Look at verse 9. But he said, but God said to me, and this is where we're at, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Let me say those hard words again. God looked at Paul and he said, I'm not going to do it, Paul, because my grace is sufficient for you. And I am made perfect in power in your weaknesses. And what's Paul's answer to that? Therefore, I will most gladly boast all the more about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may reside in me. So I take pleasure in weaknesses. Catch that. I take pleasure, delight in weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and in difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul says, I don't ask Jesus to remove this anymore. Rather, I step into the weakness. I take pleasure in the weakness, and I kind of want to write in the sidelines here, are you a sick puppy? Who takes delight in weaknesses? Who actually wants to talk about that? And he says, because God has made so much stronger in my weaknesses. And all of you that want to talk about experiencing God, I experience his grace all the more powerfully in my life because of my weaknesses. His grace is sufficient. Some of you have another translation that might read differently. I actually don't know what this translation is, but I like it. It is this: my grace is always enough. My grace is always enough. We don't like to celebrate our weaknesses. I don't like to celebrate my weaknesses. I will run from them. I will, maybe you do too, deny them. But Paul says to me clearly here, don't do it. Don't get sucker punched by Satan to believe that you are only defined by your weaknesses. Rather, embrace them and see how God's power will be put on display in your life. So we have to go through a little bit here and think of what are some weaknesses that might be on that other side of the equation. Grace is greater than what kind of weakness? I'm going to give you a couple to think about, because I don't really know the answer for you. But let me give you, I think, what Paul might be addressing, and that is this. Grace is greater than our infirmities. Grace is greater than our infirmities. The thorn that Paul speaks of here in Corinthians is not an easy little thorn. It's not like a rosebush thorn that creates a little irritation. He's not talking about something that I have an itch that I just can't quite reach. Rather, the word in the original language for thorn is more like translated stake. And I'm not talking about the kind you put on the grill. A spear is what he's talking about. To me was given a spear in my flesh. Maybe look at it that way, because I think we think, well, it's not such a big problem. You know, I don't know what his little issue is, but get over it, right, Paul? No, Paul's talking about something that is causing a great deal of pain and problems. Perhaps it's even in his mind keeping him from doing all that God wants him to do, and maybe that's what's in his mind. Now, there are some people who think that it's a temptation, that Paul has, maybe he's even having a hard time with the fact that he persecuted the church early in his life. And so the temptation is to think back on that and be guilty and feel badly about that. I don't think so. And I'll tell you why. I think it's an infirmity, mostly. And that is because he says it's a thorn in my flesh. He doesn't say it's a thorn in his mind or in his heart. He says it's a flesh issue. And so what is it? We could speculate. I can only give you some possibilities of what it might be. Some people believe it was a deformity. And it's possible because we know that Paul had many beatings. All you got to do is read through the end of chapter 11 and recognize that he had been beaten, he had been whipped, he had been stoned multiple times. Earlier in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, he was even concerned about his physical appearance, that it might have even been an obstacle to the gospel of Jesus before the church at Corinth. You can read that for yourself. There are possibilities. Some people think that he had epileptic seizures. And if living in those days, that was considered by a pagan concept to be a demonic thing. And as a result of having these epileptic seizures and being thought that you were demonically possessed, people would usually go around and spit on you. And I had not noticed this before, but Paul actually thanks the church at Galatia, in the letter to Galatians, thank you for not spitting on me. So perhaps he was having that problem. And then the more likely one that we all maybe heard about is eye trouble. Paul, in Galatians 6, talks about what large letters he used to write. And he said, this is for my own hand, you know it, because it's so largely written. We're not really sure what the infirmity was. Perhaps it was migraines, perhaps a speech impediment, because we know that he always was concerned about that, not being able to speak well in front of people. Perhaps it was stomach problems. We're not sure what it was. Why doesn't he just specifically tell us? Wouldn't it have been wonderful to know that this was the issue? I'll give you two reasons why I think he doesn't tell us. Number one is it would give him a reason to boast. And he's exactly not trying to do that. If he actually were to tell you what it was, he'd be like, you see what God really brought me through? I mean, this is pretty bad. But I can boast about that. But he doesn't want to. He wants to rather boast in his weakness. I'll give you another one. Is that you and I can look at that same passage of Scripture and identify with Paul. And he doesn't have to spell it out for us, because each one of us have some kind of thorn that we probably have pleaded with the Lord to take away from us. And I can relate a whole lot better to Paul if I can just imagine what that thorn was that he talked about. And I can know this same thing that Paul learned, and that is, my grace is enough. So grace is greater than our infirmities, and grace, let me give you another part of that equation. Grace is greater than our inabilities. Grace is greater than our inabilities. Usually we associate the word weakness with inability. I'm going to be honest with you, and I'm sure that this is true for you too. My least favorite question that they ask in a job interview is, what would you define as your greatest weakness? That's a dumb question. You're not here to hire me over my weaknesses, right? You're here to talk about what I might be able to do. And we know deep down in our hearts, if we're truly honest with the interviewer, we may not get the job if we tell them the truth. I mean, seriously, who wants to answer to that question the truth? What if I did tell you honestly that I'm an introvert and I don't really do well on teams? Oh, let me sign you up right away. Or that I'm a task-oriented person, and once I get started on something, well, I think it's a strength. You know, I work hard, but you might call it I'm a workaholic. Or who wants to be honest and say, I can't organize myself out of a paper bag? Yet Paul says this, let's discover your weakness together. And we're all along saying, let's just pretend that we did. And Paul says, but his grace is sufficient and is all that we need, even in your inabilities. You might even see God show up all the greater because of your inability. Grace is greater than our infirmities. Grace is greater than our inabilities. And I came across this story by Corrie ten Boom in her book, Tramp for the Lord, that I think captures that idea very well. In that book, she talks about this woman that she met in Russia during the Cold War, when Christians were heavily persecuted. And I'm amazed at what she wrote. Here's what she said. I'm always amazed by Corrie ten Boom's life, but this one's amazing experience that she had. This old woman was lying on a small sofa, propped up by pillows. Her body was bent and twisted almost beyond recognition by the dread disease of multiple sclerosis. Her aged husband spent all his time caring for her since she was unable to move off the sofa. In fact, there was only one part of her body that she could control. It was the index finger of her right hand. And so with that one finger, she would type all day, every day, often late up into the night. But this woman wasn't just typing, she was translating. And with that one finger, she would translate the Bible and Christian books into Russian. Her husband would hover close by, and he explained to me, Corrie says, that sometimes it takes a long time for her finger to hit the right key. Corrie ten Boom says that as she looked at this woman, wasted form on the sofa with her head pulled down and her feet curled under her body, she just cried out inwardly, Lord, do something. Why don't you just heal her? And she says that her husband sensed my anguish and gave the answer. And he said this, God has a purpose in my wife's sickness. Every other Christian in this city is being watched by the secret police. But because she's been so sick for so long, no one even looks in on her. They leave her alone, and she's the only person in all the city who can translate undetected by the police. Now, friends, you and I would look at that woman, and perhaps we would feel sorry for her. Maybe we would pity her. But I find it interesting that the one thing that seems to be destroying her, the one thing that she would most likely want to change about herself, the one thing, if she were to ask God, in my opinion, please remove it, just this one thing, but God uses her all the more powerfully because of it. His grace comes into her space, and all of a sudden, he is seen so much more powerful in her weakness. The thorn in your life, whatever it might be, I don't know what it is, creates the space that lets you experience God's grace and power. And I'm speaking from one that it's not easy. I'd rather hide it. And you would rather do the same. But I want to challenge us all today, including myself. We need to find ourselves in a place where the load is too heavy. And we cry out to the Lord, the pressure is too intense. The struggle is so overwhelming that you can't do it. And you just tell the Lord, I can't do it. We need to get to that point where we say, quit saying, I got this, Lord. Let me handle this part of it, because it's not working. And when that happens, and we're forced to trust God totally and only, which is not a bad idea, since He is the God who raises the dead. May we realize that God's grace truly is enough in our lives. I want to encourage you to do something that I would do if we could use paper here, but we can't. Go home this afternoon. Think about what God has put into your life. And I encourage you, write on the card, grace is, and use the greater than symbol. This way. Grace is greater. And I want you to do something for me. Take a moment and pray about it and ask the Lord, what do I need to put on that other side? What is it that bothers me? What weakness do I have? Whether it be in my personality, whether it be in my physical makeup, or whether it be in my skills. And just be honest with the Lord and say, grace is greater than even that. You can come up with your own category. Maybe it's something I said today. And then do something that is almost impossible to do outside of Jesus Christ intervening. And that is take delight in that moment. That God's grace is greater than even your weakness. Amen? Would you pray with me, please? Oh God, I thank you for this paradox this morning. It doesn't make a lot of sense to us that when we're weak, we're strong. Right? But God, those of us who have experienced your grace in those moments understand it. And we can celebrate it. It doesn't mean that we don't want the thorn to go away, because we would. It doesn't mean that we wish we wouldn't have had to go through what we went through. But it also does mean this, that God, you redeem it. And your grace has met us when we're the emptiest and the most vulnerable. It does mean, God, that in those moments, your power has the most potential to be clearly demonstrated. And so, God, would you let us not be afraid to lean into it, step into it, move towards it, our weakness. Step into vulnerability so that we might experience the greatness of your grace. Because it's true, your grace is greater than. It is in Jesus' name we pray. And all of God's people said, amen. Thank you for being here this morning. Thank you for our online community. And I want to encourage you to have a blessed week in the Lord. I don't have any extra announcements except for it's just good to see you. And I pray the Lord is good to you this week. We do want to wish this couple right back here, Warren and Sandy, a happy anniversary, 49 years. And Sandy says, his grace is truly Amen. When we leave, that the elders or deacons, please, would help us by dismissing from the back row up to the front. So you'll be dismissed from the back first. That way we can cut down on any of the transactions. And transactions can only happen out in the outside, okay? But please stay around outside as long as you want. Wave to people and whatever you want to do. God bless you. Let's close with this song.
Saying that's my corn. Same thing. You guys email and said I'm wearing black today.
You know, I'm just trying to break him along slowly. I get him in gold pretty soon.
Yeah, okay. No good bread.
Love it. So,
Hey, buddy.
very thorough.
Bucket, right?
Yeah.
No, sir.
I got a reminder today. Yesterday, we're going.